right, well, I guess I'll get started. And thanks again to Margot and Rebecca for helping me get all this stuff organized. And thank you, Barnaby, for being here. I was going to start by introducing our guests, and we have a guest who's not able to make it, Dr. Elise Archias from UIC in Chicago, who's a Carolee Schneemann expert. But she did supply us with really beautiful notes on her thoughts about the show and what we're going to be discussing today, this text by Maurice Merleau-Ponty called Eye and Mind. She wrote really beautifully about that text and about the show. So we're really happy to have those notes. And then our second guest is Barnaby Fitzgerald, who's a professor of art at Southern Methodist University. And yeah, there's Barnaby. He's here. Barnaby is one of my biggest mentors in painting. I worked with him at SMU, and he probably knows more about my thoughts on painting than pretty much anybody else does. He's had to listen to me more than anyone else. So I'm really, really glad to have Barnaby here. And he's got a very, very impressive professional history. His work is in several private collections, including the Yale Art Gallery and Print Collection, the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. And like I said, I'm proud to call him one of my biggest painting mentors. So like we've done for the other discussions, I'd like to just spend the first 10 minutes or so talking with Barnaby about the text to kind of introduce the idea to our participants. And then after that, 5 or 10 minutes or however long we want to talk, we'll just open it up to everybody. And so anybody who wants to ask questions can then do that. So I'm also going to share in the chat a link to this blog that I'm working on so people can respond to the discussions. And then I'm going to take that blog and people's responses and make it into a zine, kind of a collaboration with the Texas State students. So I'm going to put that link in the blog at some point here, and then people can just click the link and access the discussion there. And with that, I'll just open it up to Barnaby. Do you want to start off talking a little bit about Eye and Mind? Just start the conversation about the show and Eye and Mind.
Sure, I'd be glad to. When I read it again, because I read it years ago, first of all, you got to know that this is the most important text in painting schools throughout the world. Not so much in America. In fact, I don't know if you noticed, he made a kind of snide remark about the United States. But in the rest of the world, I was talking to Roberto Kunduro, who is the sort of the great art historian that we have now, and he was saying that in Brazil, in art schools, Merleau-Ponty is still the most important philosopher that painters read. And it makes sense because Merleau-Ponty really thought that painting is important. It's not just a sort of sideshow. The streets of Paris, in fact, one of the streets that was in the news recently, Rubensstrasse in Berlin, where it's named after, that's Germany, that's named after Rubens, the painter Rubens. So I've always noticed that the city squares, the streets, even the little streets in the United States are never named after artists, but they are in Europe. So Merleau-Ponty is a philosopher that has championed painting, has tried to reach into painting, to understand painting. And what you get is this enormous respect for it. He's been accused of being philosophically feeble by some people. And you can see why, because he's daring to say things which he doesn't explain. Mm-hmm. I would say that we should start out by noticing that he himself does not despise science as much as the first few lines of the essay would suggest. If you read closely, he's really sort of in awe of Descartes. And what Descartes did is he took away the meaning from points in space. So, instead of a toe, that's a location. And you might say that that is a kind of disembodiment of space. But Merleau-Ponty doesn't really accuse him of that. He's much more subtle about science than it would appear. But every time there's a subject, I go to Wikipedia to see what is officially sort of recognized as and said about something by the collective, and it's got it basically right, but there are some subtleties there that are missed in the text, and I think in Merleau-Ponty's philosophy in general. He's not so sure about his feelings about science. I don't think he's dividing painting from science.
No, I would say, I mean, my first thought on that is that what he's actually doing is he's beginning by, to begin the essay about painting with this discussion of science is to say that painting and science are doing a similar thing with the material world, but slightly differently. And so to me, that's really powerful because it's always something that I've thought of when because I'm a painter and I've really always been a painter. And that's how I, with my physical body, have always approached the world. And I love what Merleau-Ponty says about having at a distance, because that's how it's been to me. He describes painting and drawing processes as or the act of looking, as to when you look at something, you have something at a distance. And I always thought, I was always kind of puzzled by why, because to me that seems like it's an observational experiment with the material world to do things that way. I was always confused why, because that seems so similar to a scientific approach to me. Science has the material world and it takes it and it does things to it. And so it always confused me that society takes these two kind of observational approaches to the material world and then makes them these sort of opposites. So when Merleau-Ponty opens the essay with this critique of science and its approach to the material world, to me that's it's not this blasting of science. It's saying these two things are doing something similar and we should use the one to look at the other. So that's kind of how I interpreted the beginning. But I don't know what your thoughts are on that, Barnaby.
Because if you think about it, if you go sort of long distance, pan out and look at the essay from a distance, he's not blaming, but he's pointing out the science looks at things as if they're things in general, without a significance, a religious significance or a political significance. They're just things. And then at the last part, where he gets very excited by his own almost, I would say, passionate words, he's really saying the same thing about painting. He's saying, I'm looking at the bulk of the mountain, the mass of the thing that I'm looking at. And this goes all the way back to Aristotle, who said very simple things. The form of the table is part of the table. The table cannot be without its form. So that when you're looking at the form, you are actually not abstracting, but you're seeing the table more in its fullness, et cetera, et cetera. And there's lots of literature on that, of course. And I think that Merleau-Ponty is philosophizing in the most traditional way, in that he's analyzing aspects of things as if they really are the things, the parts of the things, or perhaps in their entirety, these parts could be replace the things, or at least I would say represent the things in a serious way, not in a copying way. In fact, he says, not copying. At one point, he says, when I paint, I don't copy.
Don't copy, yeah. Well, and the reason that I chose this text and the reason that I invited Barnaby and Elise to participate is because this text in particular is to me about the connection between two things that I think painting does, which is that it's this physical, it engages the body in this intensely physical way. It like draws attention to the fact that I have a body, I can't leave it, and everything I do, everything I produce relies on my body. But at the same time, it produces this, it gives me the power to transcend my body in a way by imagining virtual worlds, by, like just the act of looking is like, you could say, I've thought about it a lot as like where the idea of abstraction meets the physical, because my vision is inherently a part of my tactile, heavy physical body, yet it's like floating out ahead of me and creating this essentially flat image. The only reason that I have a knowledge that what I'm seeing is three-dimensional is because my hand can extend out into space
Right.
and see it. So he
Yeah.
draws attention to the fact that this text draws attention to the fact that painting is physical, yet it's like this first leap into what I kind of think about as the virtual, like I could connect it to imagination or the internet, the kind of world of images where, we kind of tend to think of those things as separate from our bodies. So painting does this thing with the body. And then as Barnaby knows, and as some of you guys know, I've done painting and performance work, and I'm really interested in the connections and differences between painting and performance. So I had invited Elise because she
Yeah.
does this research on the performance that originated in the 60s and 70s, which is the era that's been really influential to me, specifically the painter and performance artist Carolee Schneemann. So I'm really interested in how both of those practices produce images. And in the show, I was really interested in the fact that that this figure Kat Marnell, who is kind of half of the show, she, a lot of her work, her writing is about her body and about her physical experience. So she's creating images that reference her physical experience, and the whole significance of her writing and of her life is the kind of deterioration and redemption of her body through the use of substances and through eating disorder. And, it's like, to me, it's all about this kind of disintegration and redemption of the body. Like all the action takes place in her body, and we're kind of given access to it through her personality. So I'm really thinking about the differences between like the act of painting separate from a personality, and the act of living, and how how we generate images from that, and what those different kinds of images look like. Because I find that there's a huge divergence between the aesthetics of the performance art that I'm interested in, and the kind of aesthetic of the paintings that I produce, and also of, just like the experiences that I tend to gravitate towards just in my art practice. So that's kind of the reason why I am so interested in this text, and why I wanted to talk about it in terms of this show. So I don't know if you have any kind of thoughts about that, Barnaby. I know that was kind of a lot of information.
If I may,
Hmm.
I liked what I read that was written by Elise.
Hmm.
I liked that she mentions distance.
Hmm.
She mentions that distance is, first of all, it's not a ruler, it's not one thing, it's the relationships between things. So, for example, um, I really admire that she said that distance is, in fact, the property of painting,
Hmm.
and that bridging the distance, or the physical, the physicality of the paint, the recalcitrance of the material, and the body are bridging, they're bridging into each other through distance, and that there's always a space or a distance involved in the act of painting. And the act of painting is the act of reaching out and touching things. Merleau-Ponty is very angry with Bergson, sorry, the art historian at I Tatti, because he said that Italian painting was about touching. But then he he kind of contradicts himself, because by the time you get to the end, you have a feeling that he's really admiring the painter's ability to incorporate the his vision, of making it his vision a kind of, he says, some kind of carnal essence, or I actually don't like the word essence too much, as you don't. I remember you didn't. He's saying it's a kind of carnal reflection of, so the ability to see something, an object or a situation, and then internalize them and find a carnal reflection of them. That's, I think that Elise was really talking in those terms when she mentions distance, with the example of Carolee Schneemann. She does things, right? She paints with her hair, you know, on a swing, for example. That was the image that I remember from my youth. And as if why not? You know, I have hair at the top of my head. That's a kind of metaphor for brush. So why can't I make marks with it? It's a transformation of roads. So another artist, I can't remember who, talked about the brushes as if it were a broom. You know, so I'm really cleaning the surface with things. I paint things, and with this little broom, I clean out the white, and I put chairs and people. I don't remember who it was, but I like that. And I think that it is the notion, the feeling that the distances are being bridged is the essential feeling, I think, in the Merleau-Ponty. You know, he said something so wonderful about the Glasgow. He said, you know, in fact, he ends it with the paintings by the cave people in Lascaux, not Glasgow, in France. He says, you know, there are these bumps and bruises, and the stone is there, and the flashlight, you know, you can just imagine. But in fact, those kind of, the body of the support, you know, is sort of disappearing, and the painting is becoming part of it. The paintings become part of the wall, and then the wall is showing you something. The paintings in the wall are showing you something. So, and I think that the last thing he says in that particular passage is, we don't see the painting anymore, but we see with it. We see because of the paint. I think that that's just a marvelous sort of poetic, not very philosophical, but poetic way of saying paintings are about space, and that the narrative of each painting is a peculiar, very special, very private, but readable and understandable space, which is the space also inside the body. I don't know, it was a well-chosen text, because I reread it last week before. I thought it was going to be last week, so I reread it, and then I reread it again yesterday, and it was better yesterday. So
very mysterious, you know, and I'm really fascinated by the fact that it was the last thing he wrote before he died, because to me it has that sense of being like, I mean, painting also, I think, is about like, it's about space, and then extending that further, it's about the edges of things and the boundaries between things. And you can kind of feel that that Merleau-Ponty was, you know, understanding, you know, probably understanding the edges of his life, you know, the limitations of being alive. And another thing that Elise said that I thought was really interesting, and that was really relevant to me. She asked the question, is the juxtaposition with interiors a metaphor for turning inward to the particular body? Is Kat Marnell doing this or not doing this? And I think there's something just like fundamental about painting that has to do with turning inward. And a lot of the work that I've made has been about the difference between like a contemplation or inward reflection and um, communication. So often in painting, I'm going into like a state of like unconcerned reflection or like contemplation of a subject, like Cat Marnell. Then on the other hand, painting is kind of also fundamentally about communication because it becomes this thing that exists external to me that goes out in the world and says something, it goes around saying things to other people. So I find that a really interesting question, thinking about the the metaphor of interiors being something about going inward. And that's something I've been really fascinated by, that whether or not, because we think of performance as, often as a kind of spectacular thing, something that's like done in a public space or like done explicitly, like an action, physical action taken explicitly for the eyes of others at a particular moment. And especially a lot of the paintings in this show were done at a time when I was thinking in terms of like what's the difference between like kind of inserting my body in like a public space and just like what my body does in a space that's private, when I'm just like making these small movements to generate a picture while contemplating a subject that I find
Yeah,
relevant.
I have an idea. I mean,
Mm,
there's a great essay by Roland Barthes about the theater, and he's making things up really, but what he makes up is kind of interesting. Half truth, half invention. He says that in Western theater, the audience sits in the dark and feels guilty about what's going on stage. But if so, and then he says in Asian theater, and of course he hasn't really looked it up, so he's just bullshitting. But he says in Asian theater that's not the case, because you're seeing how all the machinations of what's going on. You see people walking around, moving things, while the actors or the puppets and so on. So take that away, take that conceit away, and then let's stay with the stage for a second. Now, the stage, it seems to me, is the very thing that's absent from Merleau-Ponty's idea of the painter. Take away the stage, take away the audience, take away the performance, the meaning of the play, and all you have then is the actor whose audience is really inside the actor. And for me, it just occurred to me, maybe I'm wrong, but that would be a good analysis of what I see Merleau-Ponty is describing, because in his description, there is no purpose to what the painter is doing that could be called a performance purpose. There is a performance is always for something. In fact, the very word itself suggests, that you perform, but in this case, it's an action, and it is art, and it is visible, and it has outcomes, but it is not a performance in that particular way. There's no stage, there's no audience. Now, it's what I would like, because I know Jessie quite well, and what I really liked about Jessie's performances is that they were very close to that. That the intention was not to cause a certain reaction, a certain propagandistic, wordable, sayable manifesto of any point of view, but it was just performance. It was so that, Jessie, you are very special, because your performances, the performances that I've seen, are very close to painting, about as close as you can get, actually. and still be, you know, videotaped and move around. Things like
Well, that's what I was interested in with I mean, that's really what I've been interested in with the whole notion of performance is like, that's, you know, to be honest, I got really frustrated with it, uh, especially after grad school. And I was like, I can't do this because for one, I feel like I actually need an institution to be able, you know, some sort of support to be able to do a performance that will, you know, that'll be relevant at all, because I have to have somebody to, you know, come look at me. And without an institution, you know, without being associated with a school or a museum or gallery or something, it's hard to get anybody to pay attention.
well,
And
yeah,
then,
that goes into my argument, because
yeah,
if you sort of invented performances in order to make statements that are clear, that will, you know, sort of position you, you know, in a certain slot of political persuasion, then you would find all kinds of support and endorsements and so on. But
right. So that's really, I mean, that's what I wanted to, and now increasingly, like, because there are, you know, there are things that performance can do that painting can't do, especially communicatively. And I don't want to stop doing that, but I really want to see how, you know, how I can make a painting that's as close as possible to a performance, because I think our whole idea of painting has become, you know, our idea of painting is just, you know, just, I'm saying, like, the popular general idea of painting as I see it is just kind of collapsed with image in general. So then it's just like Instagram, you know, people look at pictures, they're just looking at pictures. So it's got to be like a fast, easy, like flashy read. So painting is this like kind of disembodied little like bit of entertainment, like eye candy. It's not with the body anymore. So I wanted to make a painting that like called as much attention to the body as possible. And I wanted to make a performance that was far enough, you know, that did the same thing, that like got into that, like that thing that I understand because I've spent my whole life painting, where, you know, where it's not like we're talking about like the action of looking, the action of moving is not, you know, it's not trying to say anything particular, because that's when it's the most engaging. It's like I thought that if I could make a performance that was doing that, then I could kind of involve the audience in my experience of reality, which was always incomplete. And there was no way that I could uh I'm trying to think of, I lost the word. There was no way that I could make that up. You know, I couldn't make a picture of incompleteness. It just had to be like a shared experience.
Can't make a picture.
Yeah, I can't. Yeah,
That are just not, they're not in the picture.
yeah.
Cards.
And then, well, to have a performance like that, you have to be willing to not know what the experience is going to be, you know, then just respond to whatever's happening, you know. And
you mentioned something that's in the text, which I want to sort of recall. He said a couple of things. He says nobody blamed Cézanne for sort of painting away at L'Estaque, you know, during the Franco-Prussian War. And he then says, and Cézanne said, La vie c'est effrayant. In other words, life is scary. And so that there is this mixture of, I have to go somewhere because life is scary. I have to paint because painting is scary in another way. It's scary in a way that I can accept. Whereas life, you know, just violence in the street. In fact, Elise talks about the body and its vulnerability. You know, there's this article just yesterday in the New York Times about this piano player, a Japanese piano player that was beaten in the streets for being Chinese, you know, it's classic. So that this piano player will probably never play the piano again. And what Elise was saying really came up. It really became, you know, sort of vivid in my mind because I said, oh my God, this piano player, his body was wounded. He will not play again, even though he went to Harlem because he loved jazz, and then was beaten up by these hooligans. So that for me, the whole story of the vulnerability of the body, and so, but just all of a sudden became very emotionally clear. Mm-hmm. And then this phrase by Cézanne, you know, that life is terrifying, came up as well in my
well, which is, you know, I like that you bring that up because I feel like that's kind of a common criticism of painting, and it's one that I kind of have, like, I have this kind of sense of guilt about in a way, you know, that like that I'm not doing performance work, which is, you know, it's often seen as like the more daring thing to do. You know, that painting can be kind of an escape, and because it's not as real because you're in this studio, you know, you're protected. Every idea that comes through it's there's this barrier of aloneness that protects the act of painting, so it's safer, you know, in some really obvious ways.
But that's because things have really changed in the art world since this essay was written, you know, in the late 50s or early 60s. In fact, Ponty says nobody blames the painter for not being an activist, for not being. He says, you know, every regime that comes, you know, takes away the paintings, but they don't throw them away. Mm. It's as if even, you know, the most sort of rapacious asshole Nazi knows that degenerate painting may not be degenerate. You know? So they would put them away, but they wouldn't destroy them. And, right. And that may be a change. That may be a radical change in society that blames artists for being, you know, being cowardly, not daring to. But I thought that the whole point of what we're doing today, in a way, was to mention that your own limits, not just limits of lifetime, but limits of capacity, of concentration, of organization, and so on. Those become, in painting, those become absolutely everything. And so when you're painting, you are really confronting yourself. You're confronting your own limits in every way. And it's very scary. I think it's easier to be a martyr than to confront yourself. I think that painters, if they're serious, they're very, very brave people. And I think you're brave. You know, I think that your performance reflects that. I don't think you're brave because once in a while you touch upon a subject that might be controversial. I think it's the way you do I mean, Jesse, you're all out there. You give it everything you've got. And that's really, you know, anybody who doesn't respect that doesn't understand art, doesn't understand painting, and doesn't.
Well, I think that's true. That's true. I'm brave. No, the idea about limits, I think, is very, like, individual limits is very true of art. Like limits within, you know, within the person. You know, because I was thinking of other disciplines, you know, that require that a person it's not, I don't think it's a matter of like, you know, like pushing yourself to the limit of, you know, pain or death or something, which at one point I probably did think that about art, you know, just like pushing yourself. I think it's more like the idea of limits is in like understanding what every part of the individual person can do, you know, like what is my mind meant for? Like, what are the things that it can do? What is my what are my arms meant for? What are the things that they can do? What's my heart meant for? What are the things that it can do? You know, like how fast can it beat, but also like how slow can it beat? And then, you know, that goes as far as like, you know, moral and ethical problems too. Like I find that really interesting, the idea of the of art being like the the kind of probing of the various like levels and limits of the individual person.
Oh,
And other, you know, you could say any, you could make the argument that lots of disciplines do that. Like a businessman might, you know, like test the limits of his profession, but it has much more to do with the external world, and much less to do with the, you know, with the limitations of the individual. And I think, yeah, like as far as this painting and performance business goes, understanding the, you know, the particular function of all the different parts of an individual, and then what that means when like images are produced from it, I find that really interesting. um, I was looking at another question by Elise here. Let's see. Or let's, I also wanted to look at the questions that have been posted in the chat so far. Let's see. There's been some mention of Eve Klein, which I also think is, I mean, like Eve Klein is obviously like somebody who I'm really interested in, because he was doing a lot of, I've really thought about Eve Klein and Carolee Schneemann more than anybody else as far as like painters and artists go, because they're very obviously doing things with painting and with the body, and seeing where those things connect. And then Rebecca says, why is form beautiful? Because I think it helps us confront our worst fear, the suspicion that life may be chaos and therefore our suffering is without meaning. Robert Adams. Yeah.
I think that really reflects Cézanne.
Mm-hmm.
Cézanne went to Paris as a young man. He thought he would sort of become a painter bohemian and live in that part of Paris, Montparnasse. And he was terrified. He couldn't stick it out. So he went back home and stayed at home. You know, he married Madame Cézanne. It's very interesting. Merleau-Ponty's interviews with Madame Cézanne are published. Everybody should read them, I think. I just wanted to sort of, I had something in my mind about the performance. Yeah, somebody said here, I'd love to hear Barnaby talk about performance, specifically what Jess has done in the past. I think that the performance part of your output is very significant, Jess. I mean, if you were to stop performing altogether and just went on painting, I think that the performances which I've seen you do and followed, that would they would say plenty. They would say plenty about what it is that you're doing as a painter. For example, if you take away, just like I was the sort of a thought experiment was to take away from a play, from a staged play, everything, the audience, the script, the story, and then you would have an empty space, you know, where the actors would move and talk, and it would still be very meaningful. It would be meaningful in a different way. And if you take away from Jess, her performances are sometimes about just being a woman, speaking of vulnerability, speaking of the body, you know, this, it's just very difficult even to speak about it. But if you take even away that, if you take away that message, uh, the performances would still be very cogent. They would be very, uh, very enticing, very coinvolgente, how you say it in English, you know, where you get people on your side. You get them on your side, and you fold them in. You fold their imaginations in.
Well, I think um, I was just gonna say, I think part of that, the way that I've approached this is all making me really want to do do some sort of performance work again, or some sort of other work. But I was thinking of, like the way that I approach performance and the way that I've approached painting. Um, we've talked about it in terms of Merleau-Ponty and physicality, but then another person who I've been really interested in is Marcel Proust, who wrote Swan's Way, which is like kind of famous for that, what Barnaby's talking about, that folding in, like that becoming involved in another person's experience, which is a huge part of what the show is about. Like I became involved in Kat Marnell's experience because I was so interested in like feeling present in her weird fucked up experience. And then in the paintings of the interiors, it was like, well, here I am involved in, like, I'm literally like folding myself more and more and more into my own space by looking at it so intently. And then when other people are looking at those images, the same thing happens over and over again. And I think, Marcel Proust did that with his writing, and Swan's Way, is known for like these like lengthy, like very beautiful descriptions of memories and exactly what was happening in a given time and space. And I think that itself is intoxicating, and yeah, like a lot of my paintings and performances are about being a woman, but I don't think it's because I have a real obvious feminist message. It's just because that's what I am. And so that's what comes out. And I think there is just really something like compelling on its own about being immersed in the experience of individuals. And in the car today, I was driving around I was mailing a piece of art to my friend Jeff Gibbons in Dallas. And I was just like driving, and I sort of started having like one of these like experiences where I was just like, I'm completely folded into my experience right now. And I started thinking of, like existence as like just as a performance, like what is it like,
That's
what
really,
is like,
no, that
huh?
Jessamyn, really good. Existence as performance. That you gotta write that down.
Well, good thing it's being recorded. So I started just like listing my like the feelings that I was experiencing. And what's funny about these feelings is that they're not like I've noticed a lot of performance has this like modernist aesthetic, where everything's kind of clean and minimal, and it just has this particular appearance. But what I'm really interested in, like performatively, is like that the things that I'm experiencing have this kind of like silly quality to them. Like I wrote down like the bass in my car from Post Malone playing is vibrating my body. And I just had surgery, so I can like feel this like mass in my uterus. And like the feeling of like bumping teeth with the guy that I'm seeing right now when we're kissing, or the feeling of nicotine leaving my body because I started vaping again and then I had to quit. And now like I have this very like crazy experience of nicotine leaving my body because I cannot experience substances normally. So I'm having this really intense feeling of nicotine withdrawal. And I'm just listing things that I wrote down because I find these experiences, like these are like performative, like this can become performative if it becomes art, And I think that I love like when people share these experiences with me, I love getting folded into them, and then it becomes part of my literal real experience. But it's not like an arty experience. It's just
Oh, no, that's important.
living,
I mean, there's
uh,
difference between artiness and art. For
yeah.
example, I hope your students are listening, because one day we were in class. Jessie was my assistant. I was teaching painting or drawing, I don't remember which. And we were reading Tintern Abbey by William Wordsworth. And at the end of this really magnificent poem. So everybody's got to read it. He turns to his sister,
Oh yeah, I remember
who he
this.
absolutely adores, and he says it. He says that. He basically says, "I love you," in very 19th century English verse. But it's so net, it's so clear, and it's what Bertolt Brecht called an alienation effect, in the sense that he breaks from the form in a kind of caesura and says, all right, I've said everything about Tintern Abbey and what it means and the phases of my life and so on. And then he breaks all that and he says, I love you, to his sister at the end. And when I was reading it, the, the students were sort of eyeing their phones, texting and so on. And I turned around and Jess was right there, like really paying attention. Because it's the poet who's forgetting the performance, who's forgetting his command of English, his ability to versify, which was unsurpassed at that time, and saying something real, saying something that's not performative, that is outside of the performance. And I remember that you were really moved by that.
Yeah.
That I registered as an aspect of Jessie.
Well, I think, it really does have, it really is, this is really lining up with the show because, the show, um, like both of the bodies of work in the show, I think like when art really happens to me, it's when the, when life and art kind of like completely, like speaking of distance, they just kind of completely collapse for a second, where like there is not this separate object out there, that we're just like, I wonder what, like that's kind of cool, I wonder what it means, or oh, it means this, cool, where that's just gone and they're one and the same. And I think at least for me, that's what really captures me, when like all of the hierarchies and all of the the money and meaningfulness in society and all of that is just like, it doesn't matter anymore, because there's like a a personal thing, that a personal collapse that happens because of an object, not just the object itself. So for me, like that's kind of what Kat Marnell, it wasn't really Kat Marnell's experience or her writing. It was that I was like, in the moment that I was in, just like drinking that, drinking her life into mine. And then the same thing with my own surroundings, and there are a lot of problems, like social problems with Kat Marnell. And we've talked about that a lot at other, as part of other discussions in the show. And they're kind of I don't know, secondary to this, like this discussion of embodiment that we're having now, where like, I don't know, like, is it possible for at a moment for those things to just disappear, for it just to be like this, I don't know, this like collapsing of times and spaces with like one person's life and another person's life. And with painting, it could be like, like I'm looking at a coffee cup in my studio right now, and I mean, it really is weird, like the alienation experience of like realizing that you're just in a space and a time and there's a coffee cup over there. So anyway, I'm just rambling.
I wish that to tell you the truth, was not aware of Kat Marnell as a subject of this. I don't know how I missed that. So I'm very ignorant of what you're talking about as well.
Well, that's okay. She's just, I mean, it's not that complicated. She's a writer who got kind of well known in the early 2000s for, she was writing for like beauty magazines, but she was also like a hardcore drug addict, and started
Marnell?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So she kind of had this like total breakdown in her drug addiction while she was rising in the ranks as a beauty editor. And so she started writing all these things that were, I've done a lot of work around abjection. And so she was, giving this experience that was really sensational because it was like this pretty girl who was supposed to be writing for I can't remember, I'm forgetting, the Exojane was the magazine she was writing for. And then she's like talking about like really crazy sex experiences and doing PCP all the time and putting on makeup at the same time. And so it was just it was kind of an interesting phenomenon, and it became really popular, because it was very gritty. And then she got a book deal. So she wrote a memoir, which was just all about her, life as like this high class white girl doing a ton of drugs and, like bottoming out as an addict and alcoholic and eating disorder person, so I got really fascinated by her experience. And I made a bunch of paintings of her because she was really interesting to me. So
And
anyway,
in the show.
Yeah. Yeah. These paintings, you'll recognize a lot of the paintings. They're ones that, not that I didn't make them when I was at SMU. I made them when I was younger, but you've seen some of them. So they're paintings of her. Yeah. I made a bunch of paintings of her starting in like 2012, and I still make paintings of her. I think she's interesting. So I just like keep returning to her as a subject. But yeah, this like.
I see why she would interest you as as an interior.
Yeah. Yeah, they're like obvious.
More than an exterior. But let me ask you a question. Cat's Cradle is a title of a Kurt Vonnegut story.
Yeah, I hadn't even thought about that.
Yeah, and so that I just want you to know that I've read Kurt Vonnegut, but I only read Bluebeard and of course Fahrenheit 471 or something like that. I had not read Cat's Cradle, so I felt terribly guilty coming into this discussion without having known the book Cat's Cradle by Kurt Vonnegut. But now I feel even guiltier because I haven't read Cat Marnell. You never.
There you go. That's why you should feel guilty, because I didn't even think about the Kurt Vonnegut thing. So I've never read Cat's Cradle by Kurt Vonnegut.
I didn't read that book.
I didn't think about that either, and I've read Cat's Cradle. Jess, I was gonna ask,
Sure.
You and Barnaby both, keep referencing like the performances that you've done in the past as painting. Can you kind of just elaborate on the performance? Because I've only seen your painting. I'm not familiar with,
Yeah, I know this keeps coming up. Yeah, sure. So the performances that I've done, they've been, I guess I could describe them as like a combination of what I called momentary lived experience, which is a lot of what we've been talking about today. So like what's happening in the moment with my physical body, and kind of images, like kind of recognizable kind of tropes of like what it means, like what it is to be a woman in our society, kind of like a standard, more typical narrative, like a recognizable narrative of femininity, which are also parts of my life. So for example, I did this one called Game Day or Rape Interrupted, where I appropriated the narrative of a Law and Order SVU episode. So I just took this narrative from the Law and Order SVU episode that was called Rape Interrupted. And it was about a woman who gets, there's a rape and it's interrupted, and there's like a, like kind of standard Law and Order SVU imagery of like the woman tied up in the basement or whatever. And then I combined it with an experience from my own life where there's like a psych ward involved. And so I was wearing like a hospital gown and writing in the narrative, the woman who's hospitalized for, I called it post-rape psychosis. She escapes the psych ward and gets on one of those Lime bikes, which is one of those ride share bikes. So this was the narrative. And then I did that. So that's like the narrative that I appropriated from culture, combined it with my own life, And then I put it into momentary lived experience, which is just what's actually happening. So then I got on the line bike in the hospital gown, and I was just riding the line bike in the hospital gown through Dallas on the way to this show space. And so then I end up in the show space, and but then it's like, there is no conclusion to it. Like, there's not anything that's supposed to happen. It's like whatever happens while all of this is being acted out is just happening. And the narrative, I read the narrative intermittently. I'd like written this, kind of like mashup of this Law and Order SVU episode script, and just like the, A to point B narrative. And I just read that intermittently throughout the performance. And of course I was interacted with a lot by people at the show. So that's one performance. So they kind of involve like, kind of obvious narratives and imagery with things that are more confusing, like just what's happening moment by moment in real time. Go ahead. Yeah.
I think I'm a witness. So you weren't there. So I'm the only one who wasn't Jesse who was there in the group. So I want to say that the scenarios that Jesse used to perform are, you could almost exclude them. You could take them away. Take away all the meanings, all the context. I think that if you do that, if you take that away, all that away, we're getting very close to Merleau-Ponty idea of art, actually, painting or not.
Mm-hmm.
Because since I was there, first of all, the meanings were obvious, and yeah, I have my opinions and my feelings about that context of just the brutality of our society. But what really matters in that performance is you. You matter. You are the way you set up at the bicycled into the show where I was waiting for you. And I knew that you had bicycled all the way from SMU. That's quite a ways. So with this hospital gown, looking, being basically a clown in the
Yeah.
or some sort of Sam Beckett character, and so what really mattered to me, much more than the meaning, much more than what a journalist might have said about it in an art magazine, was the performance itself and your body, the way you treated yourself bicycling all that way, basically semi-naked with a hospital gown into a space full of people, and then reading a long essay that you had written, so that after all of that fatigue, you had to concentrate on the page and read line by line a long essay, so that our bodies then became patients and became, a choice of either being enfolded by what you were doing or not. You gave everybody the choice that painters give. Paintings don't trap you, like right. Even a minute and a half video, you got to stay there for a minute and a half. But people walk by Vermeers and spend 3 seconds on them. So the painting doesn't trap you, but it gives you a choice. Are you going to be enfolded or not? And that's what you do in your performance. So it's the greatest compliment that I could give.
Well, that's something that's really interesting and significant to me. The idea that an artwork, either can or you have the option of like requiring people to have a certain response, or I think that's why paintings are less captivating a lot of the time, because they don't captivate you. They let you decide whether or not you're going to interact. And I find that really fascinating. There's, like you said, there's an option. And in that piece in particular, there was this question of consent, because a lot of the participants in that show felt that, you know, that I had not given them an option of whether or not to engage, because I kind of like crashed into the space. And I guess, you know, I mean, I guess that what ended up happening was that people did watch it, and um, they did choose to be enfolded. But it's interesting that you say that, because I feel like some of the other participants felt that there was an issue of like,
Okay, so can I go on?
yeah,
So when you go and watch a sport that you don't particularly care for, it doesn't really matter who wins, right? You're just there. That's being trapped. But if you go and watch your 5-year-old play soccer, it's a totally different experience because the genius of the game takes over. And you realize how much you care about everything, every step, every kick, every shove, every whistle. That is a total unfolding of, because you have an emotional involvement. Now, what Merleau-Ponty, I think, is saying is that the artist Cézanne became emotionally involved in his vision, sort of like what anybody would feel if they were looking at something they had a stake in, like their 5-year-old kid, you know, playing soccer. It's not a trap in that way. So that then those people who understood that or something like that about Cézanne's paintings became involved in his work. And some others rejected it. Salvador Dalí said, he's a terrible painter. I can paint a better apple than that. You know, so I mean, there are a lot of people that rejected it, and it's fine. But what's interesting is that he managed to bridge a distance there, which is the performance's duty. And it doesn't work every time. Some people are annoyed. So I disagree with the people that were annoyed because they had to sit there, because they did not care about you. For some reason, you did not make them care about you, as I did and several other people. So it was very touching, it was very emotional to see this performance. And I think that that's what performance is, much more than propaganda, much more than, you know, political opinions and things like that. I thought that right there, this is what we've been talking about the whole time.
yeah. I know what you're saying. I have a question from Angela here. I'd like to hear Jess speak a little bit more on the reason the other participants had a problem with the performance. I think the other participants had a problem with the performance because it wasn't predictable. You know, that's how the piece was meant to be. You know, it was meant to be unpredictable. I didn't want me or anybody else to know exactly how it was going to go. But that bothered the other artists. So the way that it was set up was that there was like one of the artists had made this salt circle of like women's figures, and this was all like a collaborative installation. And so I asked the other participants beforehand if they would mind if I like intervened on the setup that they had, and they said it was fine. I asked if it was okay if the salt was disrupted in the circle, and they said it was fine. But then when I came in doing what I was doing, you know, I had embodied this like Barnaby said, I was like a kind of parody of a hysterical woman. So it was very loud. I had like a loud death metal playing, and I was wearing a hospital gown, and it wasn't quiet. It wasn't like, oh, here I am, I'm going to do my performance now, watch me. Okay, here's Jesse's performance space, now she's going to start. You know, nobody knew where the performance space was going to be, and then I just like created the space, you know. So I didn't ask permission to do I asked permission to do something, but I didn't tell anybody exactly what I was going to do. And they said that they were okay with me intervening on the space, but then when I did, they didn't like the way that I did it because it was loud. And
it worked.
Yeah,
it really was
the point. You know, it was the point. It was the point was to show up as, you know, and the, you know, the content was it was really intense content. It was rape. And so I was talking about rape in a way that was not, hushed or reverential. I turned it into I used a completely different rhetoric to talk about that narrative. And
I would go further than that. It was content without context. And in art school now, people want to know what it is that you're talking about. They want to know what kind of thing it is. But if you ever walk into a movie without knowing that it's going to be a comedy, without having a clue, and you watch a Buster Keaton movie, you'll laugh yourself sick because you haven't been prepared to laugh. You haven't been told, oh, this is going to be funny. And you take that away from the event, then the pure art, it comes out. And yes, later you could say that was a comedy, but to not know that is very helpful. And Jess broke that. She broke the skin, if you like, of the content. I think that phrase is even in the Merleau-Ponty essay.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes. And the other, yeah, actually, I see Angela asked, because you've spoken about it before, were the other participants also white? Yes, I think everybody in that group was white. It was all white women. And the group had kind of been organized, like we were one of like several collaborative groups of graduate students, and our group was women who made work about sexual experiences or sex trauma. And so yeah, it was all white women who were making work about sex trauma, and the other work was much more oblique. It was like it was approaching from a much less loud perspective. So it was just very different way of approaching that subject matter. So yeah. All the participants were white. Yeah.
I just want to say something because I just want to put a couple of words in here before this ends on your behalf. When you show paintings, the same kind of mindsets look at paintings that look at performance. Some people come with their preferences. For example, people like color, and for them color is orange and blue. For other people, the color really is a kind of radiance or some kind of vibration. So it doesn't have to be blue and orange. And Jessie's paintings, at least while she was here, I thought they were really good. They were very toned down when it comes to hue, but they were very vibrant when it comes to texture. And so the color, the light and the color came across in those terms. Now, some people are just not receptive to that. They just don't get it. They say these are not paintings, they're not paintings, they're drawings because they don't have any color. And there's very little you can do to persuade them that something else might be going on that another person actually does see. I think that's every artist has got to sort of accept that they are going to meet some kind of rejection somewhere. So let's say that you want to overcome this, but you don't want to overcome it by painting colorful paintings.
Yeah.
You want to overcome it by making paintings that are significant across the spectrum, paintings that might have some kind of heraldic or political agenda. I think that's really not a very good idea, because even though you're folding people in for some reasons, you're not folding them in for the entire reason. The entire event, the entire performance, the entire painting is not really folding them in. They're just saying, okay, because you've given it a title or you've said that this painting is about something that they might agree with.
Right.
And I think there's a lot of trepidation on the part of art students, people who are studying to become artists, because what are they going to do about big sections of their public simply rejecting connecting it to reject, basically. She had that. I saw the faculty and some of the students make objections that were really objections that are made by mindsets rather than by participatory, feelings and emotions.
Well, yeah, and it's true that, I mean, no one can expect to be admired by all. Kind of have to realize that there are going to be some who respond and others who don't. So
Yeah,
that's
but
just,
you don't even try to increase that number. You don't try to increase the number of people. I think that's very admirable. I think you're sticking to your stones, bones, guns, and doing, so far, really, really honest and excellent work.
so far. Okay. All right. Well, thanks for coming, Barnaby. And I think we've gone over by about 15 minutes here, but I'm really glad to have had you come and chat. And it was, I mean, always, as usual, like very enlightening.